I'm going to talk about wildlife photography again. I feel a little bit like I'm just cutting the same subject from different directions, but I hope in doing that, maybe there are some insights popping through, and maybe I'm coming up with things that I hadn't covered precisely before. So, in this podcast, I want to talk about how to avoid the common mistakes that many people make when they are photographing wildlife, and this includes the sort of wind up to getting there, or the planning stage as well. So I'll tell you what I'm going to talk about. So the first thing is that some people expect animals to just be there, kind of like going to a zoo, and that doesn't happen. Another mistake people make is when they buy an expensive camera, they assume that they're going to get an immediate improvement in their photographs, and while possibly they'll become a little bit sharper or better exposed, those sorts of things, compared to what they were using before, and that depends on what they were using before and what they've moved to. Essentially, you're going to get the same photographs because the camera is just the tool that you use, and it's like if you bought a chisel and you were attacking a bit of stone, you're not going to suddenly turn into Michelangelo through buying an expensive chisel. So that's another one I'll talk about. Some people don't do any research, and that is also very important, and they'll get disappointed that way. And then I'm going to talk about things like shutter speed, ISO, and also not really understanding what the camera can do for them and how to make the best use of the camera. And that's something I've spoken about a few times. There's the issue about focus pictures as well, so how you can remedy that, because you might be shooting a subject that is behind a lot of things that are going to confuse, or maybe even in front of a lot of things that will confuse the autofocus. So that might be trees, branches, that kind of stuff, or even long grass. They're the things you will often come across, so they'll all can conspire to give you a lot of out of focus pictures. You may not be prepared when something happens. That's another thing to consider. The subject might be too small, so you're not using the right lens, or you're not thinking about how to compose the picture. And finally, I do want to talk about composition. How do you set the picture up so that it's interesting? If you look at the kind of photographs that are in something like a National Geographic, how do they compare to what you're shooting? So they're broadly the subjects that I want to talk about in this particular podcast. So I'll go back to the first one, and that is just, first of all, to understand that you don't just turn up and the animals are there. And one of the frustrations in wildlife photography is that you can put a lot of effort and time, and that can include traveling to another country, spending a lot of money, and you can come away with no photographs of the animal that you've gone over to see, because animals will do their thing, and there's quite a lot of luck involved in being in the right place at the right time. So what can you do about that? Well, basically there's not too much often. So an example is when I was in Uganda this year, one of the things I wanted to photograph was chimpanzees, and I really had one shot at it. There was only one day where I was going to this particular national park, and I had to arrange a pass, and often with the national parks, you'll find that there are a limited number of passes available every year, so you have to book well in advance with a tour operator. They will have access to a certain number of passes, but once they've gone, they've gone. And certainly the case in Uganda with both gorillas and chimpanzees, they limit the size of the groups that can go every day to see these animals. So in the case of the gorillas, it was a maximum of 8 people in a group, and that was every day. So if you think about the number of people that want to go and see these animals, clearly that's going to severely limit your chances. And if you get unlucky, your chances of having a second day with them are probably very low or even non-existent. So this is something to consider, and you really do have to if you've got no control over repeat visits, then you've pretty much got to accept that you get the one shot at it, and some of these other things I'm going to talk about will also tie into that. but you've got one shot at it, and once it's gone, it's gone. Now, that may not be the case. When I went to photograph tigers in India, what I did there was we deliberately stayed in one park at Kanha. We were there for about 10 days, and we went into the park every opportunity we had. So with Kanha, on Wednesday afternoons, they actually close the park, and it's always closed at lunchtime, and it's only open specific hours in the morning, specific hours in the afternoon. And that gives the animals a bit of a rest, and it makes it easier to manage it. But it's a way of preserving the wildlife park and not overstressing the animals. And I've seen some guides when I've been in Kenya, Tanzania, places like that, in the Serengeti, they will actually drive at animals to get a response so that the people who are with them get a photograph. But that to me is not ethical. That's not the kind of group I want to be involved with. So what I did at Kanha, we just went out on every occasion we could. I think it was 17 trips in all. And we got to see tigers on just under half of those. And then of those sightings, there were probably only one or two that gave us really good photographs. The rest might be the tiger walking down a road or just sat in the bushes and not doing anything. And even that became a bit of a circus at times, although nobody was deliberately going at the tigers to get a response. So the bottom line on that is just be prepared to not get anything at all. This is just the nature of wildlife photography, and this was also the same when I was photographing whales. Quite often we would go out and there would be nothing at all. We might see a splash a long way off and that was it, or we'd just see whales swimming and just see the dorsal fin. So that would be most of the trips, and you might get breaches 1 in 3 if you were lucky, but it's that kind of a ratio. So just be aware that that's what goes on. The second thing is getting a good camera, which is great, because good cameras will give you a lot of creative control and a lot of control over lighting, depth of field, all this sort of stuff. But you do need to understand the camera and understand what the key things are about photography that you really need to know in order to get the most from it. And somebody did say to me, and this is why I kind of talk about it from time to time, is that he'd assumed that when he bought a good camera, the photographs would immediately get better. And he was very disappointed to find out his photography was exactly the same. And that's because the most important part of a camera system, to use an old quote, is the 12 inches behind the viewfinder. So when you invest in camera equipment, you do need to make sure you understand the gear. You don't need to know it hugely in depth, but you do need to understand the critical things. So exposure triangle, just have a basic understanding of what that is, how it operates. It gets overly complicated. I compare it to driving a car. You need to understand the relationship between the pressure you're putting on the throttle pedal, the accelerator, the gas pedal, the difference that makes to the speed, and what that does to your fuel consumption. So that's another triangle, and it's one that most drivers would know at least to some extent and have a basic understanding of it. And the exposure triangle is very similar with cameras, but you do need to have some understanding of it. And with that understanding, you can transform your photography because you now know what you have to change to get certain results. So do spend time getting to know your camera. And the thing I recommend is just where you live, go out and photograph as much as you can. And if you've got access to local wildlife, if you're going to do a wildlife shoot, try and shoot that. Shoot birds, they're around all over the show, so it's very easy to shoot birds, and they're a very good subject because they can be quite tricky. If you don't have birds and animals, try photographing cars because they're moving objects, even static things, trees or flowers, those kind of things. But do shoot what you can with your camera so that you begin to instinctively know what you've got to change to get a particular result. Now, I mentioned that some people don't do any research. I think that's important. You don't, again, have to do heaps of it, but do enough research to understand a little bit about the animal's behaviours, when you're likely to see them. I mean, obviously getting a local guide as well is another one. I haven't particularly mentioned that, but some people just go off on their own. and they really don't know what they're doing. So get a local guide, because they'll know the environment, they'll know the animals, they'll know other things that are going on around to help them find animals. So again, going back to India, one of the things that the guide would listen for was actually the alarm call from one of the deer, which was a bit like a bark. It sounded like a bark, like a dog's bark. And the reason they were listening for that was that deer was making that call because the chances are there was a tiger about, because the tiger was their primary predator. In fact, I think probably the only predator, thinking about it. So they would warn other animals, and it wouldn't just be other deer, but other animals are tuned into that alarm call as well, and they'll know that a tiger is in the area, and they'll get away from it. So we would be listening for that call, and that gave us a reasonable idea of where that there was a tiger there in the first place, and also where it was likely to be. And then we would kind of get as close as we could and keep our eyes out, and then look for things like tracks and other spoor, and track them down. So doing a bit of research is very, very helpful, and particularly if you're heading off somewhere and you're just going to do a bit of photography on your own. If it's a particular bird or a particular animal, just find out what you can about them, when they're most active, where they like to go. If it's a predator, they all tend to be where the prey is. So where does their prey go? Think about those kind of things and do a bit of research. Obviously, I could talk about that a lot more, but I'm not going to. Now, I also mentioned shutter speed and ISO being wrong and all of this kind of thing. So these are aspects of using the camera. So the things to be aware of there, first of all, the animal you're going to shoot, what is it doing? Are you going to try and capture pictures of it moving? So if you're going to do that, what shutter speed do you want? Do you want to shoot very fast so that you freeze it? Or do you want to get a bit of blur motion in there? Do you want it moving? Do you need to track it against a moving animal against a blurred background? Because that can be great for giving an impression of speed in your picture. Are you shooting a portrait of it? Do you want to get in close and shoot a portrait? Or are you going to do a broader picture? Are you going to look at it in context? So I'm going to come back to that particular aspect of it in a minute. So you do need to know what sort of shutter speed to use. So having decided on what kind of shutter speed, what's the environment you're in? And what I mean by that is, will the subject be brightly lit? So you can have quite a low ISO. So with a low ISO is generally better. As you go higher, the image gets grainier, and that will particularly show in things like sky, or where you've got the same color or the same tone over a larger area of the image. That will become more obvious. But if you're trying to shoot a high shutter speed in a dark environment, you'll set your aperture to get your depth of field, but you've got to have to compensate to bring the sensitivity of the camera up in order to get your shutter speed quite often. So if you don't understand what I'm talking about, I do have a course where I explain all of that. But essentially you do have to, and this is this relationship I was talking about with the exposure triangle. So you've got to understand that if you want a high shutter speed in a dark environment, you're going to have to push your ISO up to compensate. Now, it may be also that you're in an environment where the light changes very sharply, and that can be in a forest environment or where you have broken tree areas. So you might have areas of very bright sunshine getting through between the trees, and also where there's shaded areas that can be quite dark. So how do you set the camera up to cope for that if the animal might be moving quickly between one and the other? So again, you've got to have that understanding of how your camera works. Now, if the animal is going to be fairly stationary, and that makes life easier, and then you can even, if you're lucky, do a test shot, have a quick look at it, and then know what you've got to compensate. So the environment you're in will make a difference in how fast you need to shoot the animal. So again, for example, when I'd be photographing humpback whales, I would try and get my shutter speed up in the thousandth of a second, because that would freeze the motion of the animal. And I would do that because the whale is moving, it's breaching, and a breach lasts between 1 and 2 seconds, so it's over very quickly. And I was possibly moving because I might have to swing round to get the animal in frame very quickly, because you don't always know, and often you don't know where the animal is coming up, where the humpback is coming up in the water, because it's moving underwater and you can't see it. And then thirdly, the boat that I'm on is also moving most likely. So it's very rare that I'd be out there on a flat, calm day and the boat wasn't moving at all. Often we'd be moving quite a lot. So everything is moving, basically. So in order to compensate for that and get a picture where the animal is frozen and maybe even droplets of water are frozen, or the water running off its body as it comes out of the water is all frozen as well, I've got to be shooting very fast. So I need to make sure that my shutter speed is where I want it, my exposure is where I want it, my depth of field is where I want it, because I might want the background out of focus a little bit to create some depth. So you really do need to understand your camera in order to do that, and also understand what you're going for when it comes to shutter speed, ISO. Also, how to use the camera, because the semi-automatic modes will work best normally for you. That's what I think most wildlife photographers use. I certainly do. And it means that you have some control over what the camera's doing and what your final result will look like. But the camera is also doing some of the heavy lifting for you in terms of getting certain settings, calculating certain settings for you automatically. So that's important to do. Now, out of focus pictures is another common one, and I mentioned before that you might be photographing an animal that's, in the trees somewhere, or has long grass between you and it. So the reason I mentioned that, it means that the camera's autofocus might not know exactly what it's supposed to be focusing on, and the chances are it'll be focusing on the wrong thing. So again, you'll need to just understand a little bit about how your autofocus works and make sure that you have it on the best setting. And normally that would be a single pixel, often the center, but you could, or by default, it's likely to be the center pixel in the central focusing area. So you want the minimum area possible, usually in the center of the viewfinder, center of the image. But that's the one you want to be focusing on, because once you've got your camera on that spot, you can set the focus to be there. Now, I don't use the shutter button to do my focus, because usually what will happen is you'll set the focus and also the exposure by pressing the shutter button halfway down. So whatever you're pointed at that point, and as long as you hold your finger down on the shutter button, that's going to set the light reading on the camera usually, and also the autofocus. But of course, if things are moving, so this is where shooting birds is quite a good thing to practice on, because they're moving a lot, and you could be going from something that's relatively close to you to the sky or a cloud, which will go infinity. So get used to working the autofocus on something that can be moving. Now, I use back button focusing. So if you don't know what that is, again, just look it up, or again, it's in the course that I sell to teach people how to get the most from their camera. The idea of back button focusing is that you just, once you've got the point you want to focus on, you use that button to set focus, and then you can press the shutter button and move around and actually recompose the shot with your subject not in the center of the frame, and the focus doesn't change. So that's why I use that. So that's something to look at. It can take a bit of practice getting used to it, but I have it on both of the camera bodies I use normally. I use back button focusing. The next thing is the subject. So a lot of people shoot with the subject out of focus, not out of focus, but very small in the frame. So that brings you back to what lens are you using. Ideally, with most animals, you want a reasonable telephoto lens. My go-to lens is a 100 to 400, although when I was photographing gorillas, I found that a shorter zoom, a 28 to 135, was actually better. And that was because the 100 to 400 is quite long. And when you're at full zoom, if you wobble at all, if you move at all, there's quite a lot of change in where your subject is in the frame. And it's much easier, let's say, to have a blurry subject with a longer lens. So with a short zoom, because I was in an environment that was quite dark with the gorillas, I found it a lot easier to get usable shots. When I switched to the 100 to 400 and I only used it once, I just found the pictures were just too, I couldn't get a good sharp image with the 100 to 400. I really needed to be on a tripod in that situation, and I didn't have one with me. Again, if you're photographing birds, really the best lens for that in most cases is a 600mm, but you really need a tripod for that because it's too long a lens to handhold in most situations and get good sharp images. So again, think about the lens you've got, and I'm going to move on to composition and move it and include it with this. So what kind of image are you going for? Do you want to shoot portraits of animals? Do you want to get in really close? So that would lean you towards a longer lens. Or do you want to shoot them in context? You might want to shoot, say, a group of elephants in a savanna landscape or buffalo or something else. Or it may be that you've got something like a lion just following its prey, just keeping, coming in close on it. And you might want to get both animals in shot, possibly both in focus or one or other out of focus, or even switching it from one in focus to the other being in focus when they're just following their prey. There is a word for that which completely escaped me, but you're probably thinking it and saying, why doesn't he say it? And the other thing about it is with a wide shot, if you want to practice with wide, it gives you context and you can become more of a visual storyteller. Although having said that, I find good portraits of animals equally powerful because they give you a level of connection with the animal that you wouldn't normally have. And if you're one-on-one with the animal, I'm thinking here of a big predator like a lion or something like that, you wouldn't necessarily want to get that close. I've been very close to a crocodile, like a couple of meters away, and got very close up shot, but it was kind of hairy. And I've also been taking photographs of a lion, and one in particular, I could just see from the way it was looking at me, if it felt it had a good chance of catching me and eating me, it would give it a go. So, but you can, by zooming in, really capture the expression on the animal's face. And also remember that if you shoot with the biggest possible image size, and I mean that by file size, so the maximum number of pixels that your camera can give you, it gives you the opportunity to crop in and still have a reasonably good resolution on that image. So you may not be able to get in as close as you'd like with the lens that you have, but if you have quite a big raw image to start with, you will be able to crop in at least to some extent and get perhaps a more impactful photograph. And that's another thing to think about. When you've taken the shot, maybe you have to do it fast, and that will happen if you're not. So you need to be prepared when something happens. And once you've got that shot, you might be able to recrop it because the framing might not be exactly the way you want. But if a predator is suddenly going after a prey animal, then that's all happening really fast. And all you can do there is just make sure you've got your focus about right. You've got enough depth of field that the animals are in focus. And I would recommend then just having your camera set to maximum burst mode and shooting bursts, shoot several of them. And you can even do that even with an animal that's not doing very much. But if an animal is yawning, again, something like a lion or a cheetah or a tiger, that can be quite impressive. But you generally get a moment where the mouth is wide open and you can see the teeth. It might give the kind of expression that looks like it's growling or that sort of expression. In fact, you often get that with a yawn, but if you get that moment, that picture can look pretty impressive, but you've got to be ready to take the shot. So a few things to think about there. So I'll just recap on what I spoke about. So the first thing is to remember that the animals are just doing their thing. They may be moving around a large territory or a large area, and there is always the possibility that you will put a lot of time and effort and money into going to see an animal and you won't see anything at all. So just be prepared for that. And that also means being ready for when something does happen is all the more important, which I've just been speaking about. When it comes to your camera, make sure you understand the basics and practice as much as possible doing the kind of photography that you'll be doing when you're away. So do it when you're at home. If you do any little trips away from home, just always have the camera with you. Shoot as often as you can and really get to know that camera so you can adjust for different situations, different lighting, whatever the situation might be. without having to think about it too much, and definitely without having to start looking things up. I mean, you definitely don't want to be in that situation. The next thing I spoke about was doing your research. So find out about that animal. What are its habits? Are there particular times of year that it's best to go and see them if you're traveling? What time of day are you most likely to see them? What do they feed on? So that will dictate where they're likely to be. And if you can, get a guide or get somebody local who really knows the area and knows the animals, because they're going to give you the best chance of getting the kind of photograph that you'll be really pleased with and will be make the whole trip worthwhile. Okay, I then spoke about shutter speeds and ISOs. So you can get a blurry picture, and that also ties into the equipment you're using. You might want a blurry picture because it can give you movement, but most often we don't. We want to frame things, freeze that moment, that millisecond maybe. So make sure that you understand how you can achieve that on the camera equipment you have, and adjust, compensate for anything that might impact your ability to do that. So here I'm thinking about lighting primarily. As I said, be prepared for when something happens. Often with animals, it can happen pretty fast. And if you're not ready, you're going to miss it. And it's highly likely you will not get a second chance at that situation. So always be ready to go. I always have my camera on high burst mode. And look, it might be you shoot a bunch of shots that are rubbish, but all you need is that one shot. And that can make the whole trip absolutely worthwhile for you. So do be ready. Think about how you want to present your subject. So a lot of people have the subject too small. You don't want anybody looking at the picture, kind of staring at it, trying to work out where the subject is. And that leads into composition. So what sort of composition do you want? Do you want to be telling a story? Are you looking to have people connect with that animal? Are you trying to tell the story of where they live or what they're doing? All of those things affect the composition. And remember that when you take the shot, sometimes you have to do it quickly. So if you've got the maximum image size that camera is capable of, that will give you the maximum number of options when it comes to recropping and just changing the way the photograph is set up when you're looking at the post-processing stage. And just a word on post-processing, I post-process pretty much everything. Usually it's just correcting for exposure. The camera might have done a reasonable job, but I might not like exactly what it's done. So it becomes personal taste at that point. But I've got the latitude to adjust it because I've got the basics pretty much right. So that I always do. I might adjust the colors. So sometimes I'll switch. I always shoot in color, but I might change that to black and white just because of circumstances. So often if it's very overcast and it's kind of a dull looking day, I'll play around with black and white and play with the contrast, just because that will, in my opinion, it will give me a picture with greater impact, and I'm happy with that picture. So, and of course the other thing is just recropping. So I might have a picture that to me has too much of nothing in it, and I've shot it in a landscape format. I might just play with a portrait format, and that can often change the feel of an image when you do that. So think about your post-processing and just set the camera up to give you the maximum possible options. So as I say, the biggest file size, the biggest image it will capture, always shoot in RAW, and then get to know your camera equipment and how the semi-automatic modes work for you, and go from there. Now, if you do want to learn more about that, I do have training courses. You probably ought to email me on those, because as I'm recording this, they're not immediately available. That's more down to technical issues with my the way I'm selling stuff at the moment. If you want to become a Patreon member, that is linked on my website. So if you go to www.ge.photography, the Patreon membership has different levels of membership, and at least the last two of them are they're much more orientated to the photography side of it, rather than just buying my photographs or having an input on what goes into collections and that sort of thing. So there is a shift in how the membership works. So if that sounds like it's of interest, have a look on the website. You can always contact me. That is on the website. So if you'd like to know more about the photography courses, you're very welcome to contact me, and I will send you a link so you can have a look at them, see if they're for you, and take it from there. So I hope you found that interesting, and I hope that's been useful for you. And I look forward to speaking to you again on the next podcast. So bye for now. Oh, and one thing just before you go, please take a look at the 2026 wildlife calendar. That's available now. It's on the website. There's a link below the description of this podcast episode. So please take a look, and I'll speak to you next time. Bye now.